Hi, I'm Tom Burgess, and I'd like to welcome you to the third episode in From Here to Prosperity, a new podcast series on the Real Agenda Network. Now, with this series, we seek to give voice to the widespread frustration felt by so many of us at the failure of partisan politics and traditional economics to end the toxic inequality worldwide. But instead of dwelling on these grievances, I will chart a seductively simple path forward. I'll do that by articulating a fresh, simple and highly practical strategy to provide immediate and substantial relief to millions of people who are struggling to make ends meet. The content for this series is based on a book that I wrote, entitled, as you might expect, From Here to Prosperity, and it was published in 2016, and it outlines a new, practical political agenda. Unsurprisingly, the problems I address still exist today, and the solutions that I propose are still highly relevant. In the last episode in this series, we talked about the challenges to change and identified 3 issues that need to be resolved if we are to move from here to prosperity. Today, we look at these challenges in a bit more detail. They are, number 1, extreme inequality and persistent poverty. Number 2, slow economic progress, but in the widest sense, not just growth for the sake of it, but growth in well-being. And the third point is our damaged democracy. It's just that government is not working for it. The global pandemic has put all this in sharp focus. The government has had to prioritise and take drastic and urgent action to shore up the economy and ensure that livelihoods of not too many people are not destroyed. However, the government fails to address the fundamental issues and continues to paper over the cracks with sort of patched up interventions. Now, there seems to be no sign of taking action or indeed having any plans to take action that will really help build back better. For instance, the concept of levelling up, while essential and good intentions, it's not been followed through with meaningful action. It seems to have been very little progress in the last 5 years since my book was published. Take wages, for instance. The number of UK workers earning below the real living wage was 4.8 million, according to 2013 research from the Resolution Foundation. Fast forward to 2021, there are still 4.8 million jobs in the UK that pay below the real living wage. That's 1 in 6, 17.1% of UK jobs pay below what is considered is enough to live on. So let's be clear, the real living wage is based on what actually is required to live on, which is not the same as the government's arbitrary national living wage. We talked to Catherine Chapman, the director of the Living Wage Foundation, in an earlier episode on the Real Agenda. Recently, she commented that with living standards rising so rapidly, living wage rates will provide hundreds of thousands of workers and their families with greater security and stability. For the past 20 years, the living wage movement has shaped the debate on low pay, showing what is possible when responsible employers step up and provide a wage that delivers dignity. Despite this, there are still millions trapped in working poverty, struggling to keep their heads above water. And these are the people working in jobs that kept society going during the pandemic, like social care workers and cleaners. We know that the living wage is good for business as well as workers, and as we rebuild our economy post-pandemic, the real living wage must be at its heart. Now, the original research for the living wage was organised in the late 90s by my friend, the late Reverend Paul Nicholson. He was then Vicar of Turville in Buckinghamshire and gave permission for his church to be used for the Dibley TV series, which in turn led to some of the initial cash required to conduct the research. The Reverend Paul had seen first-hand the hardship of families and how their low wages were not enough to live on. His inspirational initiative has led to thousands of families seeing better living standards. It just goes to show that change can happen if you're determined enough, like the Reverend Paul. We can argue about the data, but there is a strong moral case that we should pay people enough to live on, and it is wrong not to value the services that are vital to society and hold it together, such as health and care workers, transport, sanitation, protection. We are asked to clap for health workers, and yet we do not reward them adequately for their work. And if we look at poverty, the UK is the 5th richest country in the world in terms of gross domestic product. More realistically, based on GDP per capita, The UK is still the 23rd richest out of 193 countries, with a gross national income of $42,000 US dollars per person. So by any measure, Britain is indeed one of the wealthiest countries on earth, with a quarter of Britain's wealth is held by the richest 1%. Then why, even before the coronavirus, according to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, there were an unacceptable 14.5 million people in the UK who were caught up in poverty? That equates to 1 in 5 people. Child poverty and in-work poverty has been on the rise for several years, and some groups are disproportionately likely to be pulled into poverty. Now, many of these groups are already struggling to stay afloat and so have borne the brunt of the economic and health impacts of COVID-19. So it seems there's been no progress on poverty either. Now, one thing that can make life better for low-income families is actually finding ways that their expenditure could be reduced so that they increase their disposable income. And one very large area of expenditure for low-income families is council tax, which has increased 57% in real terms over the past 20 years, according to the Taxpayers Alliance. Bad news for the 35% of households who rent, while 65% of households are homeowners, who on average have seen the average price of a home has risen an incredible 207% in the last 20 years, according to Halifax, which more than compensates for the increase in council tax. So it'd make more sense if the council tax was only paid by the property owners, as indeed it used to be many years ago, and not renters, and to adjust the council tax rate to reflect house price increases. Now, in my opinion, council tax and stamp duty should be abolished completely and replaced by a much fairer tax on the value of the land, which actually reflects the value received. More about this in future episodes and, of course, in my book. A step in the right direction is the model proposed by the Fairer Share campaign, where property owners would pay 0.48% of their property value each year, and this tax would bring in exactly the same amount of revenue as stamp duty and council tax. I was pleased to be a signatory on the letter to the government organised by Fairer Share campaign, and Andrew Dixon, the founder, outlined the case in an earlier episode of The Real Agenda. So whatever the data, it's clear millions are suffering unnecessary financial hardship, and there are some practical and immediate steps that we could take. Here are 3 for a start. Raise the national living wage to a real living wage. That benefits 4.8 million. Number 2, stop taking income tax from low-income families, as they already do not have enough to live on. And Britain has more than 25 million working people, about 80% of the workforce, earning $32,000 or less. If they did not pay income tax, then it would only reduce tax take by about 60 billion, which could be made up from taxes on wealth, which would cause no hardship. Think what an impact that would make. A third point is to make council tax only apply to property owners, not renters, and adjust the council tax bands. That will benefit 10 million households. Ideally, as I just mentioned, we could go further with a proportional property tax and ultimately a land value tax, which would also indeed fund into infrastructure. So from these 3 initiatives, we are ensuring that low-income groups and the struggling middle have a higher disposable income and a greater chance of a more fulfilled life. They are practical policy proposals, and you can find out more about that in my book and indeed in future episodes, so stay tuned. Well, I was going to talk more about slow economic progress in this episode and how the government isn't working for us, which we will address in the next episode. But I could say we're running out of time, but when I did my BBC training, they said you should never say, because it gives the impression of an unplanned programme. We'll talk about the other points in the next episode. So the facts are staring us in the face, yet governments still do not act decisively. It's not just bad, it's getting worse. Inequality is becoming more extreme, poverty destroys lives, economic progress is still fragile, and so many are disengaged from democracy that the plutocrats retain control in their own interests. So we know the problem. What do we do? It's time for a radical rethink. We'll be covering that in future episodes. Because in the next episode, we'll look further at why we need this radical rethink and if we are to move from austerity to prosperity and how we could use tax as part of the toolbox. Now, hopefully these changes could be achieved by evolution and hopefully rapid evolution, Or will there be a revolution to make change happen? What do you think? I'd love to hear your views. You can email me at tom@tomburgess.com. And the book From Here to Prosperity by Thomas J. Burgess, that's me, is available direct from the publishers at www.shepherdwalwyn.com or from good online and local bookstores. The From Here to Prosperity podcast series that you're listening to is available on the Real Agenda Network, and you can listen and subscribe free on all major podcast providers such as Amazon, Apple, Google, Spotify, and many more. Special thanks to our sponsors. Switch the workstation for your browser. Do you find yourself with too many tabs open and losing your place? Well, try switchextension.com. It's free to download. Save yourself time. I do, and it's great. So one thing is certain. People want to see change to a more compassionate and just society, as well as more courageous politicians prepared to do the right thing for people over party. It's not happening, but it can. It's urgent, and it's up to us to make it happen. We could end the unnecessary hardship suffered by millions every day if we kept the income we earn from our work and we shared more equitably the wealth we all create jointly. This could be achieved by a radical reform of the tax system away from taxes on income to taxes on wealth, and also use the tax system to encourage greater social responsibility. I call this inequality busting strategy income for me, wealth for we. Because that's how we get from here to prosperity. I'm Tom Burgess. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.